We are very pleased to have with us today Jason Fernandez from the University Institute of Lisbon in Portugal. Jason has had a varied career, a storied career in terms of starting out with law school in India, in the National Law School. So he's a trained lawyer before he's gone on to do degrees in sociology and anthropology in Spain and Portugal. He did his PhD in anthropology at his current institute in Lisbon. And that was about citizenship between India and Goa. And I guess his first book, called Citizenship in a Caste Polity, is a reworked version of his PhD dissertation. And the themes he's going to talk to us about today are going to draw on some of those questions about how the Lusophone and the Indic connect. But one of those via media where they connect is the Indian Ocean, and the Lusophone is a very important part of it. And I think what we can get a sense today is how exactly the Indian Ocean figures in the connections that you have across among Goans, the networks that forge through the Portuguese Empire and beyond into the present. So over to you, Jason, for your talk.
Thank you, Uday. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, here we are. Now, what I would request from you, Uday, is if at all I'm going too fast because I'm reading from a typed text, or if I'm not looking into the camera often enough, please let me know, because I like this to be as kind of personalized as possible. And sometimes when you're staring at a screen, you just you lose sight of the fact that in fact you're with other people. So great. So let me begin then. So in the abstract for this presentation, I promised that I would take cue from the work of the Portuguese Goan artist Vamona Navelkar to problematize the current framing of Goa as a part of the national or subcontinental and Hindu sphere, suggesting that to look at Goa in this particular way is foolishness because of the way in which it obscures the rich and complex history of this territory. Instead, we must look at Goa as a part of the large Indian Ocean world as well. Looking at Goa through this lens has a number of benefits, not least of them being the ability to contextualize Islam in Goa, and not just Goa, but the wider subcontinent, right? But secondly, to also look at the Portuguese, the other group who, despite having been a critical part of subcontinental and Indian Ocean world history for well over 5 centuries, are still often seen as foreigners in the subcontinent and intruders into the Indian Ocean world. The first section of this presentation is what I call Framing Goa. Within the small but highly contested field of Goa studies, there have been 2 ways in which Goa is represented: Goa Indica and Goa Portuguesa. As should be obvious, the first seeks to demonstrate Goa's Indianness, while the other seeks to affirm Goa's Portugueseness. The first, that is Goa Indica, as a representative frame, can be largely said to have been born as a post-colonial reaction to the strategies of the corporatist Portuguese regime, the Estado Novo, or the New State, that ran from about 1930 to 1975. It was especially when faced with the demands from the newly created Indian nation state, created in 1947, that Portugal abandoned its claims on Goa and other territories in the subcontinent, that this Portuguese tendency to assert Goa's Portugueseness and negate its quote-unquote Indianness went into overdrive. However, it could also be said that both these representational tendencies have existed for way longer than the period of decolonization. Representing Goa as Christian and Portuguese or European dates back to the time soon after the territory was politically created in 1510 through the expulsion of the Bijapuri Sultanate based in the Deccan Plateau. Goa may have been represented to the Portuguese crown as key to the control of all of India, but in reality, these political claims did not really materialize. Where Goa did play a role, however, was through the Christianization of vast portions of the peninsula and other parts of the Indian Ocean world, where it was through the exertions of missionaries under the aegis of the Portuguese crown, the Padroado or patronage, that large populations on the Konkan coast, the Malabar coast, the Coromandel coast, and as I said, other parts of the Indian Ocean world came to accept Christianity. Not without reason, therefore, Goa came to be known as the Rome of the East. Subsequent to the annexation of Goa to the Indian Union in 1961, this emphasis on the Portuguese-ness and the palpable distinctiveness of the territory from former Portuguese British Indian territory around it continued to have some purchase, as it was used to ground the image of Goa, which is now dominant, which is Goa as a Europe in India, a pleasure periphery for the Indian elite and subsequent for the larger Indian middle class. The term Goa Indica may have been coined by Caroline Ifeka in the post-colonial period, but it also has had a life in colonial history. The assertion of the Indianness of Goa can be said to have begun through the aegis of the upper caste intellectuals, of which I would like to stress primarily the Catholic elites like José Gerson de Cunha, an Orientalist scholar of Goan origin based in the British Indian city of Bombay, who lived between 1844 and 1900, and Francisco Luís Gomes, who has gone down in history for an oft-quoted sentence from a letter to the French politician Alphonse Lamartine. As you can see on the screen right now, he quoted, "I was born in the East Indies, once a cradle of poetry, blah, blah, blah. I belong to the race which composed the Mahabharata, invented chess, and this nation which made codes of its poems and formulated politics in the game is no longer alive." I am not going to go reading through the rest of the text. What I'd like to point out, however, is that these kinds of framings, we'll go on to discuss José Gerson de Cunha's formulation, but Francisco Luís Gomes as well. Both these formulations are possible only in the presence of the hegemony of the British, both globally as well as within the subcontinent, which makes nonsense of the idea that the Goan was naturally Portuguese. And so now they have to live with the idea that, with the romantic idea really, of a certain Indianness that they now tie themselves to. De Cunha has gained fame because it was his work, and De Cunha is the gentleman who has his hand on his chin in the image before you. De Cunha gained fame because it was his work that made a Puranic myth available to be used by academic history and social science. Scouring the West Coast for origin myths to his caste, or to the caste that he traditionally belonged to, De Cunha was able to assemble the Brahmanical myth of the creation of Goa according to the Sahyadri Khanda of the Skanda Purana. This myth speaks of the creation of Goa as a result of an arrow shot into the sea by Parashurama, one of the incarnations of the deity Vishnu. The territory was created, according to this myth, to give land to Brahmins who had successfully conducted an expiatory sacrifice for Parashurama. Now, De Cunha's role is important in this role because it's also typical of Catholic elites of this period who had their feet placed in both boats, one as Europeans, and we'll go to see how they were constructed as European nobility. As Catholics, they were considered European, and particularly because of their caste background, were considered noble. And so De Cunha needs to affirm and buttress up his Brahmanical heritage, which is why he goes looking for these kinds of myths so that he can buttress his own claims to European, effectively European nobility. what the Cunha had done was to make this myth respectable enough to be used in the academic work. And like the ideas of Goa Portuguesa, came into its own in the post-colonial period, as both academics and amateur intellectuals sought to find a way to integrate Goa into the Indian Union. Remember that for the large part, Goans did not participate in the anti-colonial national struggle for independence from the British. There was perhaps no need to. While the British Indian elite struggled for independence because they could not be citizens of the British Empire, the Goan elites were citizens of Portugal ever since the installation of liberal democracy in Portugal in the mid-1800s. They sent representatives to the Portuguese Parliament ever since. And in fact, Francisco Luís Gomes, whose image is before you right now, and who I mentioned a while ago, was a member of the Portuguese Parliament. But to return to the matter of hand, subsequent to the integration into the Indian Union, Goan intellectuals struggled to find ways in which they could insert themselves into the national imagination. Using a Brahmanical narrative was ideal, since to a large extent, post-colonial India was defined in Brahmanical terms. Thus, I recollect that even as a little boy with a desire to know more about Goa, all I found in terms of pre-colonial history were references to the creation of Goa by Parashurama, right? And I kind of reference these kinds of ideas in my book. I apologize for the self-promotion. I try to demonstrate the way in which, by tying Brahmanism and caste to the practice of the political practice of a avowedly secular state, what we really have is not a liberal polity in India, but in fact, a caste polity. What the popularity of these kinds of myths do is to tie the geographical and cultural space of Goa into the highly Hinduized Konkan coast. To this extent, it minimizes the foundational nature of the Portuguese conquest of the island of Goa in 1510. The conquest that is at the heart of Goan history. Recollect that there was no political Goan identity prior to this conquest, since Goa, the name of the city, is it was only after the Portuguese conquer the island and then subsequently conquer other portions of the territories around it, that the name of the island passes on to these territories, and you have the creation of a political Goan identity. What the tying of myths to the geographical and cultural space of Goa does is to consecrate a single community, that of the contemporary Gauda Saraswat Brahmins, who claim to be descendants of the priests who performed the sacrifice for Parashurama, as the community that defines Goa. This is as opposed to looking at other moments, like that of the Portuguese conquest in 1510 and other subsequent events, which could highlight multiple communities and the way they engage with each other and the larger world. And so it is to explore these other possibilities that I now turn to with the help of the work of Vamona Navelkar. So as I say, this is the second section, which I call the cure for foolishness. The image of Navelkar's work before us contains the text which captures the Arabic proverb. And I apologize for my Arabic. I speak no Arabic at all. Al-Hamak Dala Dawa Lahu, which translates to foolishness or stupidity, is a disease that has no cure or treatment. In my conversations with the artist, he had shared with me the fact that as a boy he had learned to read and write Urdu from a Catholic teacher in the neighboring village of Aldona. Using the help of those who are able to read the script, I realized, the script before me, I realized that this is not Urdu, but in fact Arabic. And it was revealed to me that this work seems to be calligraphic practice, the first line containing mistakes, which are then corrected in the line below. Navelkar's efforts in this untitled piece counter the Indian nationalist tendency captured in the Goa Indica tradition, which seeks to tie Goa to the Brahmanical subcontinent alone, demonstrating instead the centuries old and continuing connections between Goans and the larger Indian Ocean world within which they're situated. Many of you who are familiar with the Gulf region will be aware of the plentiful presence of Goans in the region. However, the ties between the Goans and Arabs predate the migration of the former to the Gulf states as a result of the economic boom of the 1950s. The eastern coastline of the Arabian Sea was frequented by Arab traders even prior to the latter's conversion to Islam. Take, for example, the myths associated with the figure of Cheruman Perumal, the Chera ruler of the territories that now constitute contemporary Kerala, which evidence this ancient proximity. In one myth, the Chera ruler, according to the myth, a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, witnessed the miracle of the splitting of the moon. On learning from visiting Arab traders of a similar event involving the Prophet, Perumal is reported to have renounced his kingdom, traveled to Mecca, and converted to Islam. In the context of such exchange, one could inquire whether Navelkar's present work operates as a suggestion of the stupidity or foolishness of contemporary identity framers who tether Goan identity to a Sanskritic one alone, while obscuring the various pluricontinental strands that have and constitute Goan identities. My reference to Cheruman Perumal is not by accident. Rather, I would like to use it to refer to the various ways in which Goans have utilized this myth in their own political processes. In 1702, Father Antonio João de Frias published a treatise of which you have this very blurry image before you. This treatise, Aureola dos Índios e Nobiliarquia Brahmana, which endeavored to establish the preeminence of his Brahmin caste. The context was obviously the battles between the dominant groups in the area, that is the Brahmins and the Shardos, and their respective attempts to seek preferment over each other as they sought to convert local caste positions into noble status within the Portuguese imperial nomenclature. As such, Father Leonardo Paes issued a rejoinder to Frias' text, which was entitled Promptuário das Definições Índicas, in 1710, seeking to put the Shardo caste in its place and recognize their role as the aristocracy of Goa. The reason why this battle is interesting for us, other than the way in which the Indian Ocean world is linked with the Atlantic, I will say more about this later on, is because one of these histories also makes reference to Cheruman Perumal. In his text, Antonio João de Frias claimed the founder of his caste groups was one of the three magi who adored the infant Jesus in the crib, known in the Western tradition as Gasper or Casper. According to Frias, he should be identified with King Cheruman Perumal, a famous figure in South Indian folklore. Frias claimed that Perumal had founded the city of Calicut and erected in it a sumptuous temple dedicated to the Virgin Mary, which was a very same temple made famous by the visit of Vasco da Gama and his companions in 1498. In the narrative of Vasco da Gama's visit to Calicut, he is reported to have entered a temple, seen a goddess being worshipped in the sanctuary, and just presumed it to be a Christian church, and then paid his respects to the statue of what he thought was the Virgin. Now, in response to Frias' argument, Leonardo Paes, on the other hand, demolished the identification of Perumal with the Magus Caspar and maliciously suggested that the king had actually converted to Islam and died in a shipwreck while sailing to Mecca, right? We can imagine, therefore, that what this suggestion would have done to Fries's claims, which were being articulated within the Catholic world of the Counter-Reformation. Now, the point is not whether Cheruman Perumal existed or not. Indeed, in his book Monsoon Islam, Sebastian Prange informs us that the greater understanding of Kerala history suggests that there was no Chera king during the time of the Prophet Muhammad who could have relinquished his throne to meet the Prophet and mark the end of unified Chera rule, which took place only in the 12th century. Moreover, critical epigraphical studies have shown that Cheraman Perumal was not the name of a specific king, but a generic title meaning great lord of the Cheras. Pranj also points out that the legend of Cheraman Perumal was not only current among Hindus on the Malabar coast, but also in other parts of the southern peninsula, namely in Tamil Nadu. What this reference to Perumal does is demonstrate two things. First, the integration of the Goan elites into a wider South Asian network of myths, which were not just Brahmanical, and this is the second point I would like to make, but that this network actively engaged with the Arab traders, who not only traded, but were also setting themselves up as residents of the peninsula and justifying themselves politically as well as religiously. With this, I move to, hold on. Yeah, okay, here we go. The third section of this presentation, which I call Somewhere Beyond the Sea. I would like now to return to the linguistic medium present in Navelkar's work, that is the Arabic language, and suggest that Arabic is not a language internal to Goan heritage alone. It is also inherent to the other spaces marked by Navelkar's journey as an artist. Born in Goa, he gained a scholarship to study the fine arts in Portugal and eventually moved for a period to work in Mozambique. Arabic, a language of the Indian Ocean world, is integral to each of these spaces. Arabic was an Iberian language prior to the establishment of the Franco-Swahili coast. Arabic maintains out, therefore, that Arabic is not to foolish eyes that assume that it is Brahmanical heritage for him and other Goan. Navelkar himself is a Brahmin, right? Mozambique, that space beyond the Arabian Sea. Before I do that, however, I would like to recollect an encounter at the Metropolitan Museum of Art some years ago. I was visiting the city and the museum in 2014 when an exhibition entitled The Flowering of Edo Period Painting was then underway. Spread over 2 centuries between the early 1500s and 1868 and marked by the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate over the Japanese islands, the Edo period is seen to have opened up a period of political stability that allowed for a variety of arts and crafts to be systematically developed. The exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum was built around a number of screens, scrolls, and other paintings from this long period. Located among the many artworks from this period was a rather large Namban screen. Now, what you see in front of you on the screen is a Namban screen, but it is not, I repeat, it was not the screen that I viewed in the Metropolitan Museum. The term Namban is often associated with Japanese art forms associated with the Portuguese expansion from the 15th century. It is worth going into the origin of the term to elaborate the point I seek to make. A Sino-Japanese word, Namban was the term used for South Asians and Southeast Asians, and in Japanese translated to the word Southern Barbarians. At around the time of the Portuguese expansion into Asia, given that the Portuguese were emerging into Japanese waters and territories from their location in South Asia, primarily but not exclusively Goa, the term came to be used for the Portuguese as well. Indeed, Namban screens profusely depict Portuguese in their distinctive baggy trousers and hats, arriving in their ships with slaves, promenading under umbrellas, and engaged in trade. What struck me about this particular screen I encountered in the Met, however, was the presence of figures that within the Namban norms of depiction looked distinctly non-Portuguese. The caption accompanying the screen read, "In 1543, a storm blew a Portuguese ship onto the tiny Japanese island of Tanegashima, and within a year, Portuguese ships began making regular visits to ports in Kyushu. The Japanese called them Namban, southern barbarians, since they were arriving from India via a southern route. A widespread frenzy of curiosity developed about these strange new arrivals in their giant ships with booming cannons, their mustaches curling beneath their noses, the dark skins of the Goanese sailors, and their exotic clothing. Always the Goan first, the caption excited my imagination. Here, far away in America, I was viewing 16th century Japanese representations of my Goan kinsmen. Contemplating the caption and the screen itself, I realized that the audience was being presented with dramatic possibilities to reimagine Goanness. To begin with, the caption indicated that the Portuguese were known not via their location in Europe, but their location in South Asia or in the Indian Ocean world. They were received in Japan to the same epithet reserved for South and Southeastern Asians. If in later times Portugal asserted a European identity for the citizens of the Estado de India, then in earlier times their own European identity was, at least temporarily, displaced in favor of a South Asian one. Indeed, delving into the life histories of the Luso descendants, that is, one of the third elite groups that consist in the Estado de India, that consisted of persons of mixed ancestry, will reveal to us, so delving into the life histories of the descendants will reveal to and self-definitions thus far, it is largely because our perspectives have been colored and blinded by a worldview that grew out of the context of British imperialism. This allows us to see, therefore, the Portuguese as in fact integral parts of the Indian Ocean world, not simply interlopers, as anti-colonial national historiographies would have us see them, but as persons who are identified as a part of this world. Indeed, we could also contemplate the Portuguese defense of the island fortress of Diu against the Ottoman forces in 1538 as part of the body of proof to refer to the Portuguese as members of the Indian Ocean world. One could argue that their defense of Diu prevented an Ottoman presence in the Indian Ocean world and the Arabian Sea, allowing for the political histories that marked the subcontinent and the Gulf states and the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea to emerge. I have this terrible thing where we have planes flying overhead, so I need to stop every now and then. But it is not just the Portuguese that I'm concerned with at this moment, however. I'm also concerned with what the caption and the screen at the Met do for the Goan. The image of the Goan on that screen is not one that is used to images of persons in European dress. For non-Catholic Goans, one is used to images of upper caste Hindu men in dhotis, shirts, and jackets. The Goans depicted on the screens are at odds with this image. the most dominant one is one that I don't have with me here, is one that is turbaned in a flowing gown and counting the beads of what looks like a tasbih or Islamic rosary. This image is fortuitous because it allows us to draw the largely marginalized Muslim into our image of Goanness in two very different ways. To begin with, um, in a context where the various Muslim communities in Goa have been excluded from our post-colonial imagination, just as the Luso-descendants and metropolitan Portuguese, the screen in the Met asserts that the Muslim is very much central to the Goan identity. There are other turbaned figures featured on the screen, and yet others who, while not in Oriental garb, but dressed like the Portuguese, are represented somewhat differently, largely to the coloration of their skin. There is one particular individual on the screen that particularly caught my eye. Situated below the clearly Portuguese man, or continental Portuguese man, identified through his cap, and the Muslim, this person is a somewhat dark-skinned man, otherwise dressed in Portuguese garb. Could this have been a native Catholic resident in the Estado de India, or was it a representation of an African in the employ or enslavement of the merchant company? At the time when I encountered the screen, I responded to these questions thinking that one would need to be much more familiar with the iconography of the Namban art. Sorry, another plane flying overhead. At the time when I encountered the screen, I responded to these questions thinking that one would need to be much more familiar with the iconography of Namban art to answer these questions. As such, I reasoned that the screen allows us to complicate the histories that produce a simplistic genealogy for the question of who is a Goan. It excludes the variety of slaves, African and Japanese, who were brought into Goa, and who no doubt mixed with locals to produce contemporary Goans. These exclusions have occurred largely to the dismemberment of the territories that constituted the former Estado de India. When Goa received statehood, it was premised on making Konkani the sole language of the state. This necessitated the exception of the largely Gujarati and Portuguese-speaking territories of Daman and Diu. In doing so, Goa was constructed as a provincial location that was the home of Konkani speakers alone. And yet, as the Namban screen highlights, Goa has been more than a small provincial location, but an international and imperial sub-center in the Indian Ocean world. It gave identity to groups of persons larger than those who could claim a mythical tie to the land. The privileging of Konkani was premised on securing the interests of Goan identity, in particular its minoritized groups, like the Catholics. But history has demonstrated that this route was a red herring. Goan Catholics are treated as second-class citizens as the forms of Konkani that they use are excluded from the official definition of the language. Crafting Konkani as central to Goan identity also rested on imagining Goa as a space of village communities. This confounded the claims of Muslims as being authentically Goan, and also undermines the claims of persons outside of the caste groups that dominated the village communities. Further, it obscures the role of the Gujarati merchants, Muslim and Hindu, who have associated with Goa for generations, as well as occluding their role in crafting a Goan economy that is not tied to agriculture. This history also impoverishes the histories of thousands of regular Goans who have no obsession with claiming a pure bloodline to Aryan groups by ignoring the multiple groups that found their way into the Estado.
Did you want to stop sharing?
No, I'm good now. Thank you.
Okay.
It is therefore to these regular Goans who, in the next section of this presentation, I call the salt of the earth. with no claims to pure Aryan bloodlines that we now turn. Some weeks ago, I found this image on a Goan group on social media. The post that was alongside indicated that it was the image of the Goan fishing community of Katembe in Mozambique. Following the caption, the post indicated that the presence of Goans in Mozambique has been documented since the 16th century. It claimed for Goan missionaries the privilege of venturing into the African bush well before the metropolitan Portuguese, going on to claim the privilege of setting up the essentials decades before the massive arrivals of the Europeans and other Asiatic groups in the 19th and the 20th centuries. The post located this particular community within this grand tradition, indicating that the communities that were charged with the repair of the boats of the Carrera das Indias settled down in various communities along the coast of Mozambique. These were the communities who were the seed for the Goan fishermen of Katembe, who, when the Carrera das Indias came to a close, took up a new line of work. If it's not clear just yet, the image we see is a photograph of one of these Goan fishing communities of Katembe in Mozambique. The community in Katembe consists of about 45 families who specialize in the fishing of prawns. Unlike other Goan communities, they are a cohesive community, claims this post, that maintains strong connections with Goa, as a result of which not only do they continue to speak Konkani, but continue to arrange for brides from Goa, a practice that has been given up by a number of other Goan communities resident in Mozambique. If you will note, I argue for the existence of multiple Goan communities rather than a single Goan community. The context for this image was probably the feast of St. Peter, patron saint of fishermen, celebrated on the 29th of June, which is marked by a maritime procession and the killing of a pig. Killing of the pig not as a sacrifice, but because pork meat is festive meat par excellence for any Goan or Portuguese celebration. The feast is marked by music and a bilingual mass in Konkani and Portuguese, through which the community reaffirms its strong ancestral linkages to Portuguese India and Portugueseness. In this context, I'd like to close this observation about this community with a quotation from the work of the Portuguese anthropologist Isabel Castro, which was also a part of this post on social media. She argues that the product of 500 years of Portuguese presence of Goa, the uniqueness that is claimed by Goans, for example, to their songs in Konkani, the tableaus of the Feast of St. Peter, also represents a demarcation of the colonial period. That is to say, the Goan community marks its difference on the one hand through its having been influenced by the Portuguese, but always by referring to Goa and not continental Portugal. We could say, therefore, that the Goans of Katembe use Goanness as a way to mark themselves doubly, in relation to the Mozambicans as Portuguese, and in relation to the continental Portuguese as Goans. Give me a moment. So, in conclusion, exploring Navelkar's image reveals a complex world that undermines the foolish simplicities of a definition of Goanness that is restricted to Brahmanical frames. It offers us a vision of Goa not merely as a peninsular location looking towards the landmass around it, but a space in the Indian Ocean world where social meaning was made by references to both edges of the Arabian Sea and included the Euro-Atlantic world. Similarly, we are able to observe the Indic identities of the Portuguese, complicating the world that the nationalists would like to paint as that of binary white colonizers versus brown colonized. Finally, a view of the subaltern groups that voyaged and continue to work in the Indian Ocean revealed to us the complexity of Indian Ocean identities. I have to confess that the word continental in the extract I shared with you above was one that I introduced into the translation from the Portuguese. This is because, let's just wait for the play. This is because the introduction of this word continental prior to Portuguese best captures the complexity of Indian Ocean identities. By virtue of being citizens of Portugal at the end of colonial rule, the Goans of Catembe were in fact as Portuguese as those in continental Portugal. Indeed, Catholics under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Goa were at one point Portuguese, or the Portuguese nation. The members of this nation, whether in Mozambique or elsewhere in the Indian Ocean world, were forced to choose one national identity or the other as a result of the racialized national politics of decolonization. But merely because the law does not permit them to be Portuguese, it does not mean that they cannot continue to assert the complexity of their identities. Thus, we can return back to the Namban screens and recognize that some of the southern barbarians may have well been the ancestors of the Goan fishermen of Mozambique, and that the continental Portuguese had an Indian identity to the Japanese. Ideal representatives of the Indian Ocean world, they are simultaneously Portuguese, Mozambican, and Goan. Thank you. We can stop sharing now. I think I'm the one to cancel.
Thank you, Jason. Right. No, I just want to point out something that Professor Alpers has said in the Q&A. So,
okay, yes.
There was an internet issue, and I think after that, we didn't have your screen being shared anymore, the PowerPoint. So if you could share the image of the Catembe Goans that in Mozambique, that would be, we'd be very
sure.
Understand what you're trying to convey.
Okay, here we are. This is the Goan group in Catembe.
Okay. This is like a contemporary kind of image.
This is a contemporary community, yes.
I see. Right. Okay. Well, we are open to questions. Thank you very much for a thought-provoking talk. And we are, I have lots of questions, but maybe, I'll formulate one of them while others are kind of thinking up their questions. If you can raise your hand, what we'll do is, since we're a small group, we can just have you ask your question and interact directly with the speaker. We don't have to type it out necessarily. So just raise your hand if you have a question. One of the things I wanted to ask you a little bit, Jason, was this, you also pointed to the Monsoon Islam book that was published a few years ago by Sebastian Trange. And one of the key arguments in that book is about the role of brokers or intermediaries, who of course make this kind of, the Monsoon Islam, the kind of the, so I'll just repeat. You referred to Sebastian Trange's Monsoon Islam, and one of the central arguments in the book concerns brokers or intermediaries, people who go between and betwixt Arabia and Kerala in his case, and how they produce the kind of pluriverse, so to speak, of Islam in the Western Indian Ocean. And I wonder if, thinking about the Goans who are in the Indian Ocean, they're coming into the Atlantic, and they're also in the Pacific Ocean in terms of the, going into Kyushu. I wonder if these connections could also be understood in some ways in terms of a kind of mediation or intermediation or brokerage, and what it means for Goans to act. Sometimes people have referred to this as a kind of sub-imperial logic, but perhaps there is another way of thinking about it. And the question of brokerage and mediation, I don't know if this is something that might be useful for you.
Right. Thank you, Uday, for that question. First, I don't think enough work has been done on Goans to contemplate to justify a claim that they're intermediaries. I don't doubt that they're intermediaries, right? But all I'm saying is that we need to now start doing work about these communities to see how they are intermediaries. I mean, it's clear. For example, Goan priests, as this post on the social media pointed out, Goan priests go from Goa to Africa. Goan priests, for example, the recently canonized Joseph Vaz, right, who is recognized as the apostle of Sri Lanka, was a Goan who goes out as a missionary. So you have Goan priests finding out across the Indian Ocean world in support of or at the service of the Portuguese Padroado to spread Catholicism, to spread and then to sustain it. So this is one kind of intermediary, right? But then you also have Goan communities in Oman, on the Swahili coast, both prior to the rise of British East Africa, but also subsequently. You have British communities in Thailand, so all along the Indian Ocean world, in Macau. So definitely these are intermediaries. I think there has been work, it has been largely work of elites, which is all very well. I don't like to posit elites versus subalterns. I think that's kind of old-fashioned. But we need to do more work on subaltern communities as well, and the way in which they produce these linkages, both within the Indian Ocean world and the way in which they link the Indian Ocean world with the Atlantic.
Just to kind of add a quick follow-up, I mean, one of the questions, let me just kind of read it out from the if you could probably see the Q&A too. Professor Alpers is asking about the origins of the Katembe community and whether it's located in the 20th century or earlier. That's one, and I kind of want to tie something in there because you talked a little bit about the priests and the people who went to it, because that is a very special kind of intermediary, right? People who are joining the clergy in particular. And I wonder if we can also, other people have written about slavery in the Lusophone world, and others have written about traders or commercial kind of elites who have gone to places like Oman and other places that you mentioned. So I wonder, and in fact, there is a connection between the question of slavery and commercial activity in shipping before the British come in, because even in the work, even in Monsoon Islam, slaves are actually very key intermediaries, business intermediaries for their masters. And so these are things which we, in terms of thinking about the role of the broker in some ways, and networks in some ways that brokers are embedded in, I wonder if, there are specific groups of people who are doing specific activities and that might be the kind of, one way in which we could kind of track down. It is obviously going to be much harder to track down, subalterns kind of from Goa and how they were kind of navigating the space. Jason, can you still hear us? Sorry, can you still hear us, Jason?
I'm sorry, I muted myself while you were speaking, but you've not lost too much.
Okay.
But I could hear you. I could hear you.
Okay. So just so if whatever definitely if you see Professor Alpers' question about the origins of the Katembe community, that you could probably start there. Yeah.
Yes, I'll start there. So, like I said, I have no details about their origins except what was shared via this post on social media, and I'm happy to share the link with you subsequently. Um, But according to this post, they say that the origins of this community lie even in the 16th century, or because this is a community that went to service the boats of the Carrera de Indias, right? So this is the claim of the post, and I would need to explore that deeper to be able to give you any definite answers. Um, to Uday, you mentioned that priests are a certain kind of intermediary, and then could you summarize what you said subsequent? Because I've forgotten. I should have made notes while you were speaking.
No. I mean, I was saying that there is a lot of work in the Indian Ocean which focuses on commercial elites, traders and merchants and so on, and those who are into working with them. And certainly, Goans were involved in places like Oman and East Africa and so on in that capacity too. Especially and this is even true of the Omani Empire, but certainly in the Lusophone world that the Omanis kind of took over in some ways. But one of the questions I had was about especially the role of slaves in the Lusophone world, and whether we know quite a bit about slaves entering into military service in the Deccan through the work of Richard Eaton and others. But what about one of the interesting points that Sebastian makes in Monsoon Islam is about how slaves serve their masters who are running businesses, right? And I wonder if those dynamics are seen outside the specifically Islamic context, and they are also seen in the Lusophone context of Goa.
Right. I have to confess that the work on slaves is not my strong point. And I'm I'm literally thinking about Goa and the Indian Ocean world. This is something that I'm struggling towards. The Indian Ocean world is a world I find myself as something of an interloper. So I'd hesitate to comment on the question of slaves, whether in the Indian Ocean world or the Lusophone world. But I want to go back to this question of slaves as intermediaries argument that we shouldn't impose a Atlantic notion of slavery onto the Indian Ocean world. And take cue from that, I just want to say, go back to the idea that thus far, the kind of Goan histories that we have are largely the histories of Goan elites. Goan elites positioning themselves as European nobility, Goan elites who are positioning themselves as Brahmins or as Kshatriya. So kind of erased Goans entirely, subaltern Goan groups entirely, who are seen as merely working, right? Or as I have documented in my book, they are seen as not having any culture, that whatever they have is kind of a crude culture, which is really not the case. So I would say that where we need to work more is to start looking at these examples of subaltern history, some of which work Pamela Gupta has done on Goans in Mozambique. So this is therefore clearly a welcome intervention. There is. Can I continue?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. So Professor Alpers, this is what if you read the post, you see that they make this essentially challenge the idea of European establishment or continental establishment, the serious Portuguese presence that you refer to. And they're saying that we were in Mozambique manning it in whatever form and building the infrastructure that was the base on which these later persons built it in the 19th century. So I'm not contesting your argument. It's possible that it is mythical, but it's quite possible that you have these Goan communities present well before the continentals come in and set themselves up in Mozambique. An anonymous attendee asked the question, asked if I could elaborate on the discrimination faced by Goan communities in different parts of the world. Recently in Bollywood, etc., we see a fetishization of Goan women and even the area. How do you think it evolved and relates to the evolution of the subaltern? Oh dear. I mean, I could go on forever. I use the work of the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos to suggest that Goans are triply colonized, first by the Portuguese, then the Portuguese are colonized by the British. So the Goans are triply colonized this way because they're colonized by a group that is kind of colonized. But so this is foundational Goans as subaltern groups. Of course, within this subaltern group, you have various degrees of subalternity. I'm not claiming that all Goans are equally subaltern. With regard to the subalternization of Goans and the Goan space continues by the Indian tourist industry, in which Goans participate, as crafting it as the space of leisure. So therefore, the space where rules don't apply, the space where you can do what you want. It's a place where you can fulfill your European fantasies of living in a tropical house or in a Portuguese house, as Goan houses are very often called. So the subordination of Goa is a very complex issue that I think we should maybe leave for another time. But thank you for that question.
Jason, Professor Alpers had raised his hand to speak, so I've got him on the panel, so to speak. So, Professor Alpers, please feel free to ask your question or anything else that you might want to ask.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. Nice to meet you for the first time. The reason I asked about the Katembi community is that, of course, the history of South Asians in Mozambique is much more complex than just Goans. It involves Vanya from Dio, as Pedro Machado and others have shown. But eventually, in the 19th century, it comes to include Tias, people coming from Zanzibar, and Goans are kind of an interesting mix in that sense. You're right that they're there from a very early period, both in the context of the church, as eventually as sepoys of one sort or another. Interesting parallel in a way, I think, to the work on British sepoys in East Africa. But the reason I'm particularly skeptical of the Katembi community's claims is because Lourenço Marques, what becomes Maputo eventually, really is a very distant outpost. The older communities, the older Indian communities, tend to be either from the Ilha, from Mozambique Island, or from the Carimba Islands, or from Calamani, or from Sofala and Yambani, those areas, not as far south as Lourenço Marques. And when the Portuguese get in the 19th century, you begin to see how fragile their situation is. And there's basically a fort and very hostile relationships with the local African communities. And it's really only when modern Lorenzo Marx starts to get built. Jean Penven might know something about this Katembe community. Anyway, my sense is that that particular community developed in the aftermath of how Lorenzo Marx shows up, and then they, not unsurprisingly, decide to claim a longer history. And there may be elements of that community that actually have deeper roots in Mozambique. But the main thing is that let's get somebody to look at that. I mean, I don't know that Pamela Gupta has actually done that community, but there's a lot of opportunity for people to pursue that. Anyway, it's very interesting, and I'm really fascinated with the way in which you've been tracking these around. And I also am a big fan of Namban screens because of the depictions of Africans. So you have many different things showing up on those screens, especially the ones in the Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon. They're terrific Namban screens there.
I guess, Jason, you may not have heard that fully, but I guess, I don't know to summarize it, but I guess there are, Professor Alpers raised some very specific questions about the community that you're referring to, the Katembe, vis-a-vis other South Asian groups that might be in Mozambique and broadly in Zanzibar and other parts of East Africa. And I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of taking the origin stories seriously, because there might be family histories, for example, which might actually trace back beyond the 19th century or whatever. But it is probably true that we don't know some of the answers to these questions, and that this particular community we may need to know more about when it really emerged in Mozambique as a specific kind of diasporic group. But again, I guess the broader issue is that I think what is really interesting in your talk, and I think that came out too in Professor Alpers' comment, is that what is really impressive in how you're able to combine the Namban screens with the question of East Africa, and to think about Goa as a kind of conduit and as a meeting point, as kind of this. That's why I keep going back to brokerage in some ways, because it's a kind of there's a kind of anthropo, in some ways, and also it's decisively shaping traffic both ways. It's looking both sides, as Eng Seng Ho said for Kerala. Can you hear us, Jason?
Doesn't look that way.
Jason, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Jason?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me, but I haven't been able to hear you for at least maybe a couple of minutes.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. All right.
The last I heard of you was where you were impressed by the way I was able to draw these various things together. So thank you.
That was it.
I sustained myself in that praise for the time that I couldn't hear you.
But before that, we were talking about the specific community of the Katembe, and how we really need to know more and do more research. Can you hear us? Yeah.
It's deeply upsetting.
We can hear you, by the way.
Okay. Okay. Agreed that there is need for more research on the Katembe community in Mozambique. And once I just want to stress that I'm not making any claim for the 16th century origins, but it seems to me that the claims that these were groups necessary to sustain the Carrera dos Indios seems to make some kind of sense. So it's possible that they weren't in Katembe, they weren't in Lawrence March, but elsewhere, and moved on to Katembe only subsequent to the end of the Carrera dos Indios, which kind of makes sense. But as I said, what would I know? I'm really new to the field. But which is why I'm not holding on to the mythical origins. Yes. And as regards the Bollywood and the Goan, the fetishization of the non-Hindu upper caste is central to Bollywood. You fetishize the Muslim, you fetishize so many other groups, and you fetishize the Goan. And I think this also is indicative of the deep discomfort of the Indian national project, of which Bollywood is a substantial supporter, with groups that are not caste Hindus. So you can either have the Goan woman is sexually active and available. The Goan man and woman drink, which makes them odd to the caste Hindu. So the problem really is but once again, it's not merely a problem with the Goans, but we should really see it as a problem spread out over a much wider group of communities. I'll end on that note, and if there are other questions, perhaps.
Any other questions? Firat or anyone? Firat is working on film, even cinema, and he also.
But I still can't hear anyone. Would it help if I left the room and got back into it?
Sure, if that's possible. You can log off and then log on, maybe. Or should we remove you?
I'm going to leave and return.
Yes. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions, it's a good time to think about any questions that you may have about, anything that you want to know about Goa and the Indian Ocean, or anything that Jason told us on the basis of his preliminary research. All right.
Okay, I'm back and I can hear you. Hooray.
Perfect. Okay. So I've just said that, if there are any questions, about what you said, or anything people want to know about the Goa Indian Ocean connections, this is your chance to ask Jason. You could just raise your hand and we can kind of, we can raise you to the status of participant, so to speak. One thing that Jason, I wanted to ask you, and I know that we've
Mm-hmm.
spoken about this briefly, is the question of the post-colonial in Goa. And, I mean, it is a very complicated question, partly because of the, what has happened since the Portuguese departed. And, but there is also the other issue, which is the beginnings, which is, 1498 and everything. Because in some ways, the Portuguese come to Goa and the Malabar coast before the Mughals come to northern India, and of course very different circumstances and so on. But we do not see the Mughal context as as one where we would talk about the post-Mughal as a post-colonial context. In a way that, for example, people in the Ottoman regions, for example, I mean in Greece, for example, they would like to apply the label of post-colonial to what has happened since the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. But now in the case of Goa, the beginning and the end are actually complicate our understanding of what is the colonial and what is the post-colonial. So maybe you can, because this is something I know that you have some thoughts about.
Thank you, Uday. In fact, with regard to the Portuguese, so often the argument is made, oh yes, the Portuguese are invaders and colonizers and this and that. But I think you can see them as colonizers and invaders only if you see the world from a British point of view, right? Or from the British Indian point of view. As you rightly pointed out, if you compare them to the Mughals, the scenario is a little different. Remember that the Portuguese were recognized as a local power by Bijapur, with which it signed a treaty. Its presence in Goa was a result of a treaty signed with the Sultanate. It also treated with Vijayanagara. So you have local sovereigns that have recognized you as a sovereign, right? Subsequently, you make the Goan, once liberalism comes in and you create a liberal polity, you integrate Goans as citizens into this polity. In fact, as the work of a friend recently come out, he speaks about a constitutional movement in Portugal, in liberal Portugal, called Perismo, which is named for a Goan, Berardo Silva Pérez, right? So you can see therefore the kind of the power of these Goan politicians in the metropole. So what is colonial? One could argue that the colonial begins once India invades and acquires Goa to itself. The colonial, of course, begins not because of invasion, but because of what happens to the rights of Goans subsequent invasion, where India requires Goans to be either Indian or Portuguese. They can't be both. So you have a situation where an apparently liberating state is asking you to give up your rights, which is something that a colonizer tends to do. So I would argue that if one uses this kind of rights perspective, it is India which is the colonial state and not Portugal, given that Portugal is recognized as a local potentate, as a crown by local sovereigns. So yes, this is, and incidentally, it's very interesting that the Mughals, we don't dare talk about the Mughals as colonizers, because that would then imperil the relationship of the Indian state with the Muslim elite. I mean, the Muslim elite hardly matter in contemporary India. They may have mattered in 1947. They've been effectively fixed ever since. Which is why perhaps you can think of, we have the way in which history is being rewritten today. But we don't see the Mughals as colonizers. In which case, why do we see the Portuguese as colonizers? Is it because we have a racialized view of the world, which is what nationalists tend to have in any case? It's just an inverse kind of racism. But I'll stop there.
Any other questions, thoughts in terms of, Maybe, I don't know if you want to say something a little bit about Goans in the Gulf, for example, because I remember that you said a little bit about some of this, about how it kind of plays out in places like Oman in particular, but definitely other parts of the Gulf too. And because that's a connection that perhaps also you could explore, since you have a kind of personal kind of history or angle that you bring to it.
I don't know how much of a personal history I can bring to the discussion. Um, all too often, I think the Gulf now tends to be a staging ground, at least for Goan Catholics, to move onward elsewhere. So their children get education in either Indian schools or other kinds of schools. And then if you can afford it, you move off to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, to the US, to England even. And I think this was definitely true of, let's say, a generation, let's say for the past 30 years. Especially because Goan Catholics feel increasingly imperiled within Goa and are looking for ways out. And use, therefore, their Portuguese citizenship as a way to continue to surf on Indian Ocean waves, as it were. So yes, I mean, one could raise the issue of the possibilities of citizenship in the Gulf states, but I think you and your colleagues seem to be doing interesting work around the idea of the Gulf cities and how do we understand citizenship within these cities. So I look forward to that work. Maybe I really look forward to how you rework the understanding of citizenship and participation and rights.
Thank you very much, Jason. This has been a very interesting 1.5 hours, despite all the technical difficulties. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for everyone who's joined. And we hope to do this again next month. So please keep an eye out for our next events. So we'll be emailing everyone shortly. Thank you very much, and have a good evening wherever you are.
Thank you.